talk about. Um, so I'm Bonnie. Welcome everybody to the Rapid Reviews. Probably most of you have been here already, at least to one Rapid Reviews before this. Let's see. So I actually want to start with a confession, which is all the posters say that there are 42 books being discussed today, and I didn't notice till the very end that two people chose one of the same books. So they're actually going to have a 2-minute conversation about that one book instead of reviewing it in 1 minute each. Let's see. So hopefully you each got a list of books we're going to be talking about, and we're just going to go down them. It's alphabetical by the author's last name. So we'll just do it in that order. And all the books are here to be checked out at the end of the event, so feel free to check them out. There are checkout stations back by Amber, and there will be one over by Tobias. There's one book that's currently already checked out by a student, so if you want to check out Brendel at the end, just put it on hold, and when it comes back, you can check it out. And if someone beats you to one that you want to check out, then you can also put that on hold after the person checks it out. And that means you'll get an email when it gets returned, and we'll save it for you. Let's see. Oh, and one last thing while you're listening to these wonderful rapid reviewers, think about whether you might want to do it sometime in the future. I think, especially we're looking for students for the spring semester. It would be the first reading day of the spring semester, May something. So let me know if you're interested in doing it in the future, and I can contact you next semester about it. There are a bunch of past rapid reviewers here too who can tell you how much fun it is. So let me introduce our reviewers. You probably all know one another. Haley and Maya and Jodi and Matan, and thank you so much for doing this, you guys. Oh, I know, I always forget this part. If you want to, you can spend a minute just telling us how you chose the group of books that you chose.
I have a lot of juvenile and children's fiction here, and I'm not sure if that is a comment on my maturity level. I think that I was reflecting on books that have been most important to developing certain ideas at different times in my life. Just thinking about my development as a person and how these books parallel that. I have one that I just recently read this last year, and some that my dad used to read to me when I was a child.
I chose winter books because it's winter break, and these are all books. And what I mean by winter books is, I guess, that not that they're like wintry in topic really, but that they're just really good to sit down with for a long, long time. Like a lot of these I read in one sitting or a couple hour long sitting. So they're all books that you can just sit down with a big cup of tea and just like really get into. So that was kind of fun.
Some of mine are like that too, where they're really good stories. In fact, my first one is one that I first read over one of my winter breaks from college here. So I thought that was kind of fun to bring into this pile. A lot of them have sword play and fantasy stuff going on. Some of it's historical, and some of it is just really inspiring. So things that you can plow through, like with Maya's, or things that you can read a little bit, think about, put away for a while, and then come back to it later.
So mine is an accounting of failed attempts, really. I started out by wanting to share some of my favorite science fiction books. I was always a huge science fiction reader. I'm in deep sympathy with the writers and with the whole idea of science fiction. And I used to get 8 at a time in New York in those, sidewalk stands where you can get a book for 25 cents, and I would get 8 and read 3 of them on the, hour and a half subway ride home and back, and I would usually end up throwing away 75% of them. But 25% were gems, And some of these are the gems. But then I decided to include Borges because a lot of these books are kind of books about books, or hack into what a book is and how books are written. And then I strayed even further because that was and I ran into this book, which is different yet again. And then there's doesn't do anything about books, but is just really cool. And so that's the story of that. It's a woeful tale of abject failure. Anyway.
Thank you. Yeah. So you guys know how it goes. I'll set the timer, and if it goes off while you're talking, by all means, finish your thought, and then we'll move on to the next one. All right. So who do we start with here?
Right. My book to start off with is The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. And I actually have a confession to start out with. I was on the Rites and Rituals Bridges trip my freshman year here, and we were not supposed to bring books on the trip. That was like a big rule, and I broke it, and I brought this book with me. And I sat in the woods for 2 days alone and fasting and not doing anything else except for sort of like reading and like looking out at the trees and like getting lost in this book. And it was quite the experience. It's like a magical realism, kind of like Gael Garcia Marquez, if anyone, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, sorry, if any of you have ever read him. And it's the story of a family that focuses mostly on the women, which is really amazing, and it's really full of like really strong women, and it's kind of dizzy and somber and colorful and neat.
That's for Buzzard.
My first book is The Star's My Destination by Alfred Bester, and it's actually a very famous in the circles, the science fiction circles. Alfred Bester is one of my favorite characters as a novelist because in the 50s he wrote these two seminal novels of science fiction, and then he got himself a job. He became the editor of Holiday magazine, I think, one of those travel magazines. And he really quit writing science fiction regularly for the next maybe 35 or 40 years. And afterwards he got back to it, but the spark was gone. So he left with these two novels, this being one of them, and maybe 25 or 30 short stories, and are all just considered masterpieces. The Star is My Destination. I should probably mention, I shouldn't mention, great book. Jorge Luis Borges should be the patron saint of librarians everywhere, and that his stories are often in and around books and the beauty of books and the written word. This collection, I'll tell you, I read it maybe 20 years ago, first time. To read Borges is like eating one of those really condensed chocolates that have very little sugar content. It's a very intense experience, and you want to do it in small doses. That was my experience. And luckily, he works perfectly well for this because I think all of his output is either poems or short stories. And each of these stories I found myself thinking about for days and weeks afterwards. A particularly useful one in my career was The Garden of Forking Paths, which made me think about alternative ways of arranging information through time. And also probably helped all these guys that manufactured fantasy books where you pick your own path. This is probably where it was invented. I think I'm done.
Oh, yeah, it's me. Okay. I have no idea what this book is about. I've read it 3 times. I still can't say. This is The Master Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. And it is one of the greatest literary mysteries that I've stumbled upon. It's poetry, it's philosophy, it's a satire, it's a romance. There are 3 or more parallel plots happening on multiple levels of reality. And it basically brings, I don't know if I want to get into the plot, that's really confusing. If I were to summarize the message of the book though, it's that, or what I took from it anyway, it's that in the mysteries, in the shadows, in the things that we don't understand, and in the paradoxes, That's really where the truth lies, and the reason that we know that is because when I read this book, I felt like I understood something that I couldn't articulate, and the truths that you find in those shadows are just breathtakingly beautiful. Plus, there's a really interesting rewrite of the Gospels if you're interested in theology. And yeah. Oh, that's me again.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. This is also an interesting book for theologians, and it's a young adult novel, as I said before. That I had a few of those, and it's in a very different tradition than most of the ones that you find on the shelves of Barnes and Noble. It's about a boy who's raised in a deeply Catholic environment and has a huge amount of guilt. Thinks that he's responsible for the suffering of everyone around him, including the death of his infant brother Michael, who he thinks was an incarnation of the Saint Michael. As he approaches his 16th birthday, he makes a plan for suicide. It's a very depressing, dark book, but he finds that the closer he gets to that day, the more beautiful his life becomes, and his father starts communicating with him again. He finds purpose in his life. And it's good for anyone who understands Christian guilt, who's raised Christian and acquired that. And there's some beautiful writing and characters in it. Okay.
Yeah. This is The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper, which is the second in the Dark is Rising sequence. And as I mentioned, this was a book that I read over my first winter break, actually, as a student at Marlboro. It was strongly recommended to me by my friend Kevin Clark. So I wasn't much of a reader when I was younger, and so I didn't read a whole lot of any of these kinds of books. Like most people are like, oh, you didn't read blah, blah, blah? No, I did not. Well, you've got to read this one. So I read this one. And what's wonderful about this is not only that the main character, Will Stanton, is a wonderfully realized 11-year-old who is very heroic and goes on a wonderful self-discovery journey filled with Celtic mythology everywhere. This is rife with that. All of Susan Cooper's Dark is Rising books is all lifted with a lot of Celtic and King Arthur, set in Wales and all over that countryside. But they're also just really great journeys, and it happens around Christmas time. So really good for this time of year.
Me again. I think one of the unfortunate things about Philip K. Dick becoming a very famous writer now is that a lot of his stories have been made into film, and because they've been made into film, they've become very neat. And one of the things I really appreciate about Philip K. Dick is that he's a very messy writer. The ideas are very important in his book, and he doesn't mind some bad copy along the way as long as the idea gets conveyed. This is one of those books. Now Wait for Last Year, there's time travel through drugs, there's some kind of alternate reality situation, but the thing that got me into this book is really interesting, detailed, and intriguing setting of propositions about what's real and what's fake. All these ideas happen here in abundance in a very interestingly and haphazardly put way, which if you like jazz, you might appreciate. I think the writing we learn to do here has to do with excising words we don't need. And I think it's always useful to remember that sometimes you need words you don't need, especially in fiction.
I have Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard, which is one of my favorite books. And it's this bizarre combination of nature writing and theology. It's kind of like, reading it is kind of like taking a walk through the woods where you're like thinking about a lot of different things, and like you might be thinking about God or your breakfast or you're remembering an old teacher or something like that, and all of these things sort of come together and they're somehow centered in the place where you are. And I'm going to read When the doctor took her bandages off and led her into the garden, the girl who was no longer blind saw the trees with the lights in it. It was for this tree I searched through the peach orchards of summer, in the forests of fall, and down winter and spring for years. Then one day I was walking along Tinker Creek, thinking of nothing at all, when I saw the tree with the lights in it. I saw the backyard cedar where the morning doves roost, charged and transfigured, each cell buzzing with flame. I stood on the grass with the lights in it, grass that was wholly fire, utterly focused and utterly dreamed. It was less like being seen than like being for the first. It was less like seeing than being for the first time seen, knocked breathless by a powerful glance. And she goes on.
This is Life Mask by Emma Donoghue. One of her more recent books has become very famous, called Room. This is one of her earlier ones. She's done a lot of wonderful historical fiction, and this is, at the moment, my favorite historical fiction. It takes place in London right before the French Revolution, and this particularly focuses on three characters who were friends and were part of the elite class. Anne Dahmer, who was the only female sculptress who actually got famous and was really supported to pursue that much more masculine art form. Her work still exists out there. Eliza Farren, the most famous comedic actress of the day, and the Earl of Derby, who was actively courting her even though his wife was ailing but still alive. And he also, he's the particular Earl of Derby that the Derby race is named for. And so it goes through their friendship and their drama, and there's a lot of it, and lots of scandal and supposed scandal. They're really strong, wonderfully realized characters. That's something I love. This is any of these books that are fictional, that's what attracts me about them, is that the characters are so wonderfully vivid and go through these excellent journeys. And their lives intertwine in such interesting ways, and they make stupid choices, wonderful choices. I've read this one more than any of the books on here. That's how much I love the stories of this one.
Okay, Half Magic. This is the book that I read most when I was a kid. It's a child's book. I think it was written in the 20s sometime, by Edward Eager, who wrote a bunch of children's books. Oh, it's 1954, but it takes place in the 20s. And it's about 4 children who are having a really boring summer vacation, and then one of the children finds a little token, like a coin on the sidewalk, and she picks it up, puts it in her pocket, and a few minutes later idly makes a wish for something exciting to happen. And as they start to make wishes, they realize that this token grants wishes, but only in halves. And so if they wish for something, only half of it will come true. Like they wish to go to a desert island, and then they find themselves stranded in the middle of just a desert. And for instance, when she wished for something exciting to happen, a bunch of fire trucks came around the corner of the road and raced down the street, and they followed them, and they're like, oh, there's a big fire, that's exciting, but then it was a doll, like a playhouse in somebody's backyard that was on fire. And so it's really delightful and very well realized and mature, like I can still read it now, and there's sequels too.
Moll Cutpurse, Her True History by Ellen Galford is about Moll Cutpurse, who really existed. I was introduced to this particular character when I was working on my plan at Marlboro. There's a great play about her called The Roaring Girl by Thomas Middleton and Thomas Dekker. And she existed in London. She cross-dressed, as is pictured, and smoked and owned a tavern, and on a dare rode into church on horseback with full plate armor. I needed to know a lot more about her, and I love that there is a fictional telling of what her life could have been like. It's a very vivid, fun portrait of what she could have been like. She falls in love with this very cute apothecary woman down the road. They have adventures together. It's also a nice picture of that time period of around 1603 in London and what it might have smelled like and looked like and felt like.
This book Grendel by John Gardner expands on Beowulf, which is obviously one of the most fundamental fundamental texts to the English-speaking consciousness. And it does so very experimentally because we're brought into the consciousness of Grendel, who is the other. I mean, if you ask most literature teachers, that Grendel is the fundamental example of the other. And so in this book, you're plunged into his consciousness, and it's definitely an exploration of the function of language in consciousness, because while Grendel is mute in Beowulf, he can speak here, and so he's struggling to articulate himself, struggling to communicate himself to you, who's the only other person in the book who understands him. Well, actually, that's not true, but he's struggling to communicate himself to the readers who have only known Beowulf, and so it's a really interesting reading experience. The language is experimental, like I said, and just be ready to be plunged in the consciousness of the other.
The Tipping Point, How Little Things Can Make a Big Difference by Malcolm Gladwell. I read not quite a year ago, and it is just that. It's an exploration of how little changes in somebody's life, or the way someone does things, can bring about enormous positive change. He identifies the types of people who are involved with making huge changes. So what sort of characteristics they all share, almost as if what their resume is. He talks about people who are connectors, who are the folks who know everyone who can get a thing done, and then they connect those people together so that they can get a thing done even more efficiently. They're exactly who you need to know if you need to know the person you need to know. And then also the folks who are mavens, who know everything about a particular thing. Absolutely everything. They are experts about that particular thing. So he goes into that, and then he goes into specific examples of changes that made a huge difference, including cleaning graffiti off of the subways of New York, and how that almost eliminated crime. Two-part invention, The Story of a Marriage by Madeleine L'Engle. Most people know her fictional works, A Wrinkle in Time, and all of those series. This is an autobiographical story of her marriage to her husband, and chronicling also his very slow death and succumbing to cancer. So she talks about when she first met him and falling in love, and it is a very rich, sometimes painful, but beautiful telling of true devotion and a beautiful relationship that I hope that I can live up to in my own marriage. One of the quotations is something that my wife and I will frequently put in cards to people who are getting married, because we feel it really sums it all up. Love of music, of sunsets and sea, a liking for the same kind of people. Political opinions that are not radically divergent. A similar stance as we look at the stars and think of the marvelous strangeness of this universe. These are what build a marriage, and it is never to be taken for granted.
Megan. I love Ursula K. Le Guin. Great writer. I love everything I read by her. A lot of it goes into the realms of fantasy, and some of it goes into the realms of nonfiction. She's a terrifically prolific and always great writer. The Left Hand of Darkness is a science fiction book, and she imagines a world that has no gender, in which when it's time to make children, a couple gets together and the gender forms momentarily and randomly. And what I find enormously beautiful about this book is that people don't get more righteous or better acting or less mean to each other or less violent. They just do it in ways that are unfamiliar to us. And so it's a very gripping human story, just different kind of human. So it's really, really nice. And I do everything in batches. I plan with this. Jonathan Lethem, another one of my favorite writers. I initially gravitated to him because we lived in the same neighborhood in Brooklyn, and at that time he was writing science fiction books. So it's almost like I didn't break my pattern, but I did, because this is actually a detective story, and I appreciate this book very much because I like it when a writer tries to just flex some writerly muscles. And in this case, he did that by imbuing his hero with Tourette's. So what ends up happening, the narrator of the story has Tourette's, and there's always these slides into Tourette language, Tourette passages. Very powerful that way. And so in terms of writing technique, it's very impressive. And in terms of the scope, it's very modest, and it focuses on one neighborhood in Brooklyn, which we used to go to all the time. It's wonderful.
I'm actually going to talk about The Hero and the Crown first because it happens first. So, The Hero and the Crown by Robin McKinley. Imagine Anne of Green Gables, except she has a sword and kills dragons, and trains a war horse how to be a real horse again. That's essentially the story and the character Erin's journey. She lives in a very patriarchal fantasy setting, and she's constantly reminded of her low birth and her witch mother by many in the court of this kingdom of Damar, even though her father tries to be encouraging. She's red-haired, she's awkward, she makes lots of mistakes but is really bold at them. She does things on dares, again, kind of the Anne of Green Gables feel. But she also kicks a lot of butt, and she ends up getting her sword, teaching herself to kill dragons. She learns how to make many things possible that weren't possible. And based on this and her becoming a legend from killing one of the most dangerous dragons ever, the world is transformed, and in the world with the blue sword, another young woman, this is many, many years later, inherits her legacy. So there's a new way of riding horses that Erin invented, that now everyone, of course, does that. They're constantly on the lookout for who is the next woman who is going to be the hero. And Harry ends up being, again, an unlikely candidate, but is then recognized like, no, you are the one, even though she feels she's awkward and lost and an orphan. I love these two in sequence because they provide such strong female adolescent characters who wield swords in a very non-cheesy, very empowering, well-written way. I love Robin McKinley's writing. I love how feisty the characters are, very well realized, very full, complete worlds. So I recommend reading them Hero first, although I read Blue Sword first and it was still quite enjoyable.
My next book is Coming Into the Country by Jean McPhee. It's about, it's nonfiction, it's about Alaska during the time that it was becoming a state and about the decade afterwards, when the political scene there was very weird because it was all of these very crazy sort of people trying to form a government in this very faraway place where it didn't really feel like government mattered. And there's a bunch of like kayak trips and bush pilots and like carousing in it, and it's a really good read. And being from Alaska, I was very excited to find it. And I read it for the first time last year when I was writing a paper for a class, and I read it and then called my parents and I was like, you guys, you gotta read this book. It's so cool. And then I told them the name of it and they just laughed at me because they're like, Maya, every young person coming up to Alaska between the years of like 1976 and 1989 had this book in their backpacks. So this book is responsible for like half the population of Alaska. Veinte Poemas de Amor en Canción Desesperada is a book that was written by Pablo Neruda pretty early on in his career. He was very young, I think, when he wrote this. I discovered it after I had about 2 years of now forgotten Spanish under my belt. And it became an obsession. I would just read it to myself aloud all the time. The language continually surprises me, and I mean that both in terms of semantics and the sounds that kind of go together. At the same time, it seems inevitable, the way that the words are arranged. I used this poems from this book as punctuation, sort of in a play that I wrote and directed my senior year of high school. I just sort of used it to express certain things that were going on in the play. And so, I mean, this has been very important to the development of what I understand poetry to be. I think that Pablo Neruda said, and I might be misquoting here, that poetry is words arranged on a page. And this is a very appealing and moving arrangement of words.
And actually, a lot of the way Mary Oliver writes her poems are arranged in a way that after I've read them, I feel, oh, yeah, that is how the world works. And that is how I see it. And so I'm going to read two of my favorite ones. This one's called Hallelujah. Everyone should be born into this world happy and loving everything. But in truth, it rarely works that way. For myself, I have spent my life clamoring toward it. Hallelujah, anyway, I'm not where I started. And have you too been trudging like that, sometimes almost forgetting how wondrous the world is and how miraculously kind some people can be? And have you too decided that probably nothing important is ever easy? Not say for the first 60 years. Hallelujah, I'm 60 now and even a little more, and some days I feel I have wings. I want to write something so simply. I want to write something so simply about love or about pain that even as you are reading, you feel it, and as you read, you keep feeling it, and though it be my story, it will be common. Though it be singular, it will be known to you, so that by the end you will think, no, you will realize that it was all the while yourself arranging the words, that it was all the time words that you yourself, out of your own heart, had been saying.
I also have a Mary Oliver book. This is one of her more recent ones. It's called Thirst, and it chronicles loss. She talks a lot about the death of her partner and the death of her beloved companion dog, but also about gaining, because it's about her gaining her faith, and so there's a lot of faith and a lot of grief and sort of exploration of grief, and there's just one very short poem that I want to read. It's called What I Said at Her Service. When we pray to love God perfectly, surely we do not mean only. Lord, see how well I have done.
This is the only Michael Pollan book that I have read. I've actually not really read any of the food-oriented ones, and this one happened before the food ones. Second Nature, A Gardener's Education. And I'm a big gardener. And this is him chronicling his journey to becoming a gardener and sort of reasoning, make peace with, well, is gardening really ethical to the land? Are we destroying it when we garden, or are we actually fulfilling our true calling as humans to be the keepers of the land, to be the ones who make sure that everything is going okay? That was really a revelation to me, because there are sometimes that I feel like, oh, me pulling these weeds, why do I bother doing that? Maybe it's just sort of worthless. It's just aesthetics. What really struck me was he talked about some controversial decisions that the Nature Conservancy has made about certain places to leave them alone, and whether or not they would be better if there was some active care for them rather than just letting them go all to weeds. Very interesting read. So,
Jodi and I both chose the same book. it's Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke.
Yeah.
Um,
When did you discover this one?
I got this years ago. I was like maybe 10, and it was a gift from a nanny and sort of like a foster, like an older sister that was not really my older sister, and she was the person who like taught me how to read, and so then once I was instilled with the love of reading, she knew that I would probably come on some dark times in books, and then gave me this book to help fight that. And I didn't read it for a long time, but when I did finally last year sometime like actually sit down with it and read it, it just knocked me off my feet, and I've read it countless times since. And it's really a book that you can open to any part and find something that is going to speak to you, so you can just page through it.
Yeah, that's definitely been my experience with it. It's a book that I find that I bring when I'm traveling by myself, because it keeps me company. Since the correspondence that happens in it is long distance anyway, it just has that feel, and frequently Rilke himself is traveling when he's writing the letters to the young poet who is writing to him for advice. He said this young poet sends his poetry to Rilke saying, please give me your opinions about my work. I will treasure every word you can give me about that. And Rilke basically saying, well, you need to learn how to be with yourself and be in the world and be okay with that. I'm not going to teach you how to be a poet, but I can give you advice on just how to be yourself.
It's very much about solitude, and being alone inside your head and being okay with that, and about fate and how you have to sort of both accept it and take the risks to change it around at the same time, and how there's like a weird balance in that, of both like action and non-action.
Was that the 2 minutes?
That was 2 minutes.
Wow!
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't get to read the quotation. Oh well.
But highly recommend.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a little series here. My next book is Jitterbug Perfume by Tom Robbins. I had a really hard time choosing which Tom Robbins book to present because he is my favorite author. And his books are really, really bizarre, and they sometimes take a few times to get into. I think I started this book like 3 or 4 times before I actually got into it. But I did eventually get into it because I was on a boat with my dad for 3 days, anchored in the same spot, and because there was like this really awful storm going on, and we didn't move for 3 days, and it's like this tiny little boat, and I sat in the same little spot in the cabin and read this book in one sitting, and it's long, it's like got really small pages. And it was really intense because there's like time travel, and there's like beet perfume, and a lot of really weird historical references, like this guy from like Eastern Europe like travels to India and becomes like a shaman, and then falls in love with this girl, and then they both die, but they don't die, and then they come back, and then they like meet in Paris years later, and it's like very strange and very Tom Robbins, and I think one of his best books. And there's, as always, some very wry and very poignant life advice in it as well. And then next I have Franny and Zoe by J.D. Salinger, which is another book that is was really formative for me. I read it when I was on foreign exchange my junior year of high school, and it is a beacon in any existential crisis, because that's really all that it's about. And it's basically the whole thing is a conversation, and there's this really great part where one of the main characters, Zoe, is like sitting in the bathtub for a really long time, and his mom like comes in with in her bathrobe, and they're both like chain smoking the whole time, and she's just like nagging at him, and he's like telling her like, why are you here right now? But it's like this conversation that's layered with like so much love and caring and so much weight to it, because like he has like a couple siblings that have died, and his sister is in the living room like breaking down and like wrestling with God, like, and her mom is just trying to get her to eat some soup, and it's like very wonderful portrait of a family and also of the struggle to like find God and wonder if that's even what you should be doing, and finding your place in the world. And it's short.
This is also short. Does anyone recognize this book? Yeah, this is a wonderful book, but don't stop here. I recommend reading all of Maurice Sendak. He's just a wonderful writer. This book is, I don't even know how to talk about it because it's so deeply ingrained in my consciousness. It's a book that my dad used to read me often when I was a kid. And it's been so formative in developing my ideas about love, about fear, about compassion, wildness, and self-assertion. I mean, like I said, it's beautiful. The pictures, the writing, the structure, everything about it is beautiful. I think that I have a few picture books in here, and I think that I'm a bit more sensitive to those came more quickly to my mind because of the recent passing of my father. And I'd actually, if it's okay with you guys, I'd like to pull out my personal copy, the one that he gave me on my 17th birthday, and read what he wrote. All right. Happy birthday, Haley. I will never forget reading Tucker and You, this book. Don't forget, as you sail through this life, that you can roar your terrible roar, gnash your terrible teeth, roll your terrible eyes, and show your terrible claws. That supper will be waiting for you, and it will still be hot. Love, Dad.
Let's see. Okay. I have the collected poems of Robert Service, who's my dad's favorite poet. He has a copy of this book that he brings with him everywhere, like all over the place. He has carted around on fishing boats and trips to God knows where, hunting trips. And he always used to recite pieces of this poetry to me when I was a kid. And so like this was the poetry that I knew before I knew that poetry was a thing. And there's a really wonderful stanza from The Spell of the Yukon that he always used to recite to me. That was, I've stood in some mighty mount hollow that's plumb full of hush to the brim. I've watched the big crimson sun wallow in crimson and gold and grow dim, till the moon set the pearly peaks gleaming and the stars tumbled out neck and crop, and I thought that I surely was dreaming with a piece of the world piled on top. And it's poetry that just begs to be read aloud, so it's nice for winter.
This book also begs to be read aloud. I think it's one of Dr. Seuss's best, actually. It's a cool book. It's a really cool book. It's Green Eggs and Ham. The language sounds really beautiful together, and it's very repetitive and comforting. In the face of this giant mystery, Green Eggs and Ham, it actually kind of reminds me of Grendel in that, we were talking about the exploration of the other, and the book of how like the truth lies in the great mysteries of the world. Also, there's this really fascinating character, Sam I Am, whose very name asserts his presence in the world. This book is begging for more interpretation. I think that I'm surprised that critics haven't focused on this book more, like the academic literary community. Yeah, I would love to write a paper about this book. It's a cool book, and this is another book that my dad used to read aloud to me often when I was a kid. And he probably wrote it to me actually because I was a picky eater. It didn't really help that.
Me again. Okay, The Rediscovery of Man by Cordwainer Smith, whose actual name is Paul Lindbergher, and this is another writer with a real job. Paul Lindbergher is was actually one of the foremost authorities on psychological warfare. He's one of the inventors of psychological warfare in the Korean War. Wrote the book about psychological warfare and taught, I forget which, but in Ivy University. On his spare time, he would write science fiction. And all of his book, this is actually the entirety of his work as Cordwainer Smith minus one novel. And what's amazing about his work is that it all happens in one universe, which is a term sci-fi geeks are well aware of. It's all within one historical line that spans something like 75,000 years. Um, and it is deeply influenced by a Chinese storytelling, which he was immersed in from a very young age. He grew up in China. So, very beautiful story.
Stargirl was one of the young adult novels that I mentioned I put on here. Jerry Spinelli is a really wonderful author of that genre. Maniac McGee, Crash, these are all really great books. This is a kind of familiar story. It's a story of a girl who moves through school and she's really different. She captures the attention of another kid who's trying to fit in. She plays the ukulele, like me, and she's amazingly honest. She calls herself Stargirl, and she just doesn't fit in, but she's okay with that. So superficially, it's another novel about being yourself and accepting who you are. But there's some really big universal ideas in here. She calls herself Stargirl because she knows that at one point she was probably made up. Her matter was composed. Sorry, the matter that composes her body was in a star at one point. That she's the same stuff as stars. There's some beautiful description, really well developed and interesting characters, and a horribly ambiguous ending. Yeah, it's a beautiful book.
Alright, my last book is Under Milkwood by Dylan Thomas, who's a fantastic poet, but this is not quite poetry, and not quite a play, and not quite prose. It's a really interesting mix of all three. It's called A Play for Voices, and it just consists of a bunch of different voices. And it chronicles a day in the life of a small coastal Welsh village, similar to where Dylan Thomas grew up and spent a lot of his time. And it's kind of a satire, but also a love letter. And his language is just completely ridiculous and fun. And I'm trying to find this one part, which I don't know how I will be able to find. I could I'll just read part of it. Outside, the sun springs down on the rough and tumbling town. It runs through the hedges of Goosegard Lane, cuffing the birds to sing. Spring whips down green down Cockle Row, and the shells ring out. Lagerub, this snip of a morning, is wild fruit and warm. The streets, fields, sands, and waters springing in the young sun. Evans the deaf presses hard with black gloves on the coffin of his breast in case his heart jumps out. And it's silly and fun. Calvin and Hobbes. As a kid with stuffed animals and a schizophrenic imagination, I always connected with these stories about a boy and his stuffed tiger, who is named Hobbes for some reason. I've never really quite understood the allusion to the philosopher Hobbes. If anyone can clarify that for me later, I'd love that. Anyway, so it really speaks to people with various levels of sanity, though, not just for people who had imaginary friends that they took with them everywhere. There's a lot that you discover about yourself, though, when you call yourself by another name and start talking to yourself. So Calvin's identity has always been a really interesting thing to me. And I love the way that his other half is expressed on Hobbes. All the parts of him that we don't see expressed in his being are expressed through Hobbes. It's humorous, it's powerful, and it's insane, fun. And the wagon rides are especially great. Those are probably my favorite parts of the book. There are lots of great symbols like that can be read into in different ways. Also, the subversiveness of Calvin is interesting too.
Random Acts of Senseless Violence is probably one of the most sad books I've ever read. There's a kind of an inflation these days, dystopias featuring strong teenage female lead. But this one is a much earlier version, and it's actually the dystopia I don't survive. This is high tragedy. It's in the format of a diary kept by this girl, Lola. I think what's most powerful about this is that the language changes as her world collapses. The actual words she uses change in very moving ways into a kind of a surreal language. I'll give you an example. So it starts, I never wrote you on Monday because I wasted too much time thinking about what I should write. I think years from now, a diary will be interesting when you can read it and see what you're doing. Very briefly, page 255. Sorry about that. Mama says she missed me while she clinicked. She nearly comaed this morning till I walked her back forth and poured coffee down her. Now she's bedded, eyeing ceiling ways like she's looked long and hard enough. She'll viz what's downcoming with time enough to duck. And it's powerful because you actually understand it by the time you read the whole book.
I've been telling people that this is one of my favorite books since last fall, but I actually didn't read it until this fall. I didn't read it all the way through. No, there was one scene that I would get to that was just so devastating, and I found myself so deep in despair I could not possibly continue. And so I tried to read it many, many times because it was one of my favorite half books. I finally managed to finish it under the guidance, the empathetic guidance of Geraldine this semester in 20th Century Novel. And I mean, the things that she does with consciousness are just completely unreal. There are so many ways to look at it. You can, it's like this crazy web of people, and for the most part, they're completely separate and they can't understand, even though they're all looking at the same things. They can't understand each other, and yet there are these connecting factors that she brings. She brings to our attention. What else did I say about this? She's very famous for what she did with the consciousness, and we were talking again about the exploration of the other. And so, these characters don't understand each other, but we get to see what connects them. That's what's really beautiful about it.
Yay! Thank you, reviewers. That was wonderful. So again, the books are here. I want to ask, would you guys be okay if we let Jodi just read the little excerpt that she wanted from?
Oh, good.
Is that okay?
Let me see if I can find it. Yes, there it is. I would like to beg of you, dear friend, as well as I can, to have patience with everything that remains unsolved in your heart. Try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books written in a very foreign language. Do not now look for the answers. They cannot now be given to you because you would not live them. It is a question of experiencing everything. At present, you need to live the question. Perhaps you will gradually, without even noticing it, find yourself experiencing the answer some distant day.
All right.